Hi, I'm Dr. Jack West, and I'm a thoracic medical oncologist at the City of Hope Comprehensive Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area.
And I'm Dr. Julia Rotow. I'm also a thoracic medical oncologist at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, Massachusetts.
We're here at ASCO 2023 in Chicago, where we've been seeing some really blockbuster presentations in thoracic oncology. And many of these have brought up some important questions about the clinical implications that we need to discuss a little further. One of the most important trials, as you would expect based on its status in the plenary session, was ADAURA, which tested adjuvant osimertinib, a third generation EGFR inhibitor that we've come to use as our first line standard of care really overwhelmingly over the past more than 5 years. And this was actually initially presented back in 2020 at a plenary session as well. The trial is designed to test the value of 3 years of adjuvant osimertinib or placebo, generally, but not mandated to be after adjuvant chemotherapy, for patients who had resected stage 1B to 3A EGFR mutation positive non-small cell lung cancer. We've known for years that the disease-free survival benefit is overwhelmingly positive, and that led to an FDA approval that has really made this essentially a standard of care, maybe not a mandate, but very widely practiced, at least in the US. What we got this year, and this was Roy Herbst presenting the data again, but now focusing on overall survival. We knew from a press release a few weeks to months ago that it was positive for this. The question was how positive, and we saw that it's pretty substantial. Hazard ratio of 0.49 and an absolute improvement at 5 years in the broader population of 1B to 3A of 12%. So definitely substantial. But one of the issues with this is that the control arm did not have everyone get osimertinib at progression if they had relapse, and only 43% of the patients who got subsequent treatment at all ended up getting osimertinib, with the others getting another EGFR TKI, which we know is a little inferior, if not a lot inferior, or chemotherapy, which would not be our choice. So I just put it to you to say, what do you think is the clinical significance of this finding, with the context that this was already a standard of care, but a lot of people have been holding out to see the overall survival to really clarify what it does or doesn't do for patients?
Yeah, I agree. This was, I think, very exciting data, very compelling data, but also very important data to consider in the broader context. I think many of us, our standard of care had shifted based on the disease-free survival data. But of course, the gold standard in any adjuvant setting is the overall survival. That's really what we're trying to modify when we're treating after curative intent therapy. This data, I think, was particularly important or awaited because of what we know about earlier generation EGFR TKIs in the adjuvant setting. So erlotinib, gefitinib, first generation TKIs, had been looked at in the adjuvant space, and they prolonged disease-free survival, but did not prolong overall survival. So there was an open question, will we see overall survival advantage with osimertinib in this setting now? And it's a third generation TKI, it has better CNS activity. It was a longer duration of treatment, 3 years instead of 1 or 2 years. And these may have all impacted some of the results that we've seen now in the overall survival analysis, showing an improved overall survival. And to me, my takeaway is that this reinforces my own practice at this time, where I am using adjuvant osimertinib for 3 years after resection in stage 1B through 3A lung cancer.
Let me ask, the trial went to 3 years, and it's interesting that the follow-up disease-free survival data presented and published last year in New England Journal of Medicine showed that while there was still a big DFS benefit, it was pretty clear that the DFS curve was dropping off as soon as you ended that 3-year period, which is the same kind of pattern that we've seen with the other EGFR TKIs, and raises the question, are we curing anybody, or are we just deferring the relapse that you'd see? And if the latter, can you make it up on the back end by just treating the people who need it if or when they relapse, and sparing everyone else years of a therapy that costs a lot of money and has toxicities that, that people are having to sustain for years at a time. We have a significant survival benefit at this point in time, but will that also be clearly attenuated starting with another 9 or 12 months of follow-up?
I agree. You can see the shape of the disease-free survival curves. They absolutely do begin to come together, mirroring what we've seen in older drugs after that end of the 3-year treatment point. And what I suspect long-term is, as you have said, probably some patients need a very prolonged course of TKI therapy, those who really have residual microscopic disease, not radiographically apparent disease. And there are those patients who are cured by surgery who genuinely need no adjuvant therapy at all. Of course, it's the challenge to know the difference between these two patient populations. Now, we do have those tools emerging, right? We're going to have MRD assays available.
Minimal residual
disease assays available, which continue to demonstrate in prospective and retrospective studies that the presence of minimal residual disease, for example, within the plasma on a blood test, predicts for very high relapse risk. And the absence in an adequately sensitive test predicts for relapse-free survival. So I think aspirationally, while we may need to apply this sort of data to most patients now, I hope in the future we will use more dynamic measures to predict better who truly needs this therapy. Now, you mentioned the curves coming together at 3 years. I agree. 3 years is, why would we choose that number, right? You either need therapy or you don't. Our older studies, our prior studies did 1 to 2 years. There are studies ongoing looking at even more prolonged courses of treatment.
And in the meantime, you're going to have clinic patients who, we're now 3 years out from the initial presentation of the data. So you're going to start having patients where you have to have this decision. Do you stop for good or do you keep it going?
Exactly. That decision point is coming. We're just about 3 years out from the original approval in the adjuvant setting. So we're going to have to make this decision with our patients. And there are trials looking at this. The Target study is looking at 5 years in a single arm study. And so we will eventually have more data from that, though, of course, not guiding our decisions today or tomorrow. But the stakes get even higher in, for example, patients treated with chemoradiation for curative intent, where the ADAURA study is looking at indefinite osimertinib as a consolidation therapy strategy. Right. And that's a large commitment on behalf of the patient to an ongoing treatment that carries some toxicities over time.
And in patients who may be cured without it. And
exactly.
They don't want to have them taking it as alligator repellent if they don't need it at all.
Yeah. Now, I will say with the trends we saw in the ADAURA data showing increasing magnitude of overall survival benefit or survival benefit in our higher stage patients, I certainly hope that we'll see benefit as well in our post-chemo radiation patients. But it does speak to how critical it is to have biomarkers to more in a more personalized fashion select patients with these sorts of very long-term therapies. Yeah.
I want to ask, how concerned or bothered are you about the control arm having such limited access to osimertinib? Because there was an amendment to the protocol that allowed patients access to osimertinib after April of 2020, but this was our standard of care years before that. And I think it's unfortunate when patients don't have access to the best treatments we would routinely use in our own clinics. And it makes it a trial that isn't purely about timing of adjuvant versus get it at relapse if needed, but now access. It's 100% of patients getting treated versus less than 50% of patients on the other arm getting access to OC at any time over the course of their disease.
I agree, because you want a clean study where you're truly looking at, does it matter starting at first versus starting at relapse? And instead we have starting at first versus starting at relapse, but maybe not with what is our current optimal standard of care for metastatic EGFR lung cancer. And that does make the data a little more difficult to interpret. I would love to see a subgroup analysis of only those patients who had drug access on crossover and really look at that population. Now, of course, that bias is in the other direction, where we know in routine clinical practice, there's always dropout as you move from one line of therapy to the next. There will always be patients who won't get that first line metastatic therapy, who won't get that second line resistance therapy.
But it's not more than 50% of our patients.
It's not more than 50%, I agree. Yeah, so that is, I think, a real caveat to put on this data. In my opinion, it doesn't stop me from using this regimen. I think to me, it's our standard of care at this time, but it is something to be mindful of when interpreting the data.
Well, you brought up the issue of minimal residual disease and doing serial testing, and I hope that we get to a point where they are with CML, where you can do these assessments and really give bespoke therapy just as needed or withdraw it monitor, add it back as needed, but not get behind the curve. That's where I hope we get to.
I agree. We're not there yet in lung cancer, but we're beginning to have the tools to do it. I think as we get these more highly sensitive residual disease testing, hopefully we can, again, aim for that undetectable status and adjust therapy as needed to continue to achieve it. And I hope that's our future in lung cancer.
Well, thanks. Great discussion of a pretty complex topic, even though the top line story is extremely positive. It's always a little nuanced.
Absolutely. Thank you.